All right, Mr. Best, I have 7:30. Let's get started.
Welcome to the June 29th Transportation Commission meeting. The first item on the agenda is citizen comment, and we have one speaker for citizen comment, Bernard Byrne. Mr. Byrne?
I'm here to talk about the problem on Glebe Road in Ballston, which you may have heard about, that was created for cyclists by the county staff's idea to put parking on Glebe Road. This is in Ballston, between Henderson Road and Fairfax Drive, including the area around Wilson Boulevard. This was not ever put in this idea of putting parking. It was never put in the master transportation plan. It was never given a public process. It was just put into a site plan. And so they didn't even consider the impact on cyclists or anything else when they did this. Well, at a recent site, naturally the problem is it creates a dooring hazard for cyclists. If people park on the side, somebody opens the door and you know what happens to a bicycle, it's that. The result is that on the sidewalk, I always, on that section that's already been done, which is north of Wilson Boulevard, I always go on the sidewalk. This creates conflicts with pedestrians. It's certainly many conflicts when they build the new development which is going up, which will have a Target store there. This is basically a recipe for a disaster. Now, basically, the county board at the last time directed staff to come up with a solution, work with Bicycle Advisory Committee. The county staff simply said there's no feasible solution, they can't put bike lanes in. They said there are alternative routes, they can put signs on or something. There are no alternative routes that parallel that way. It's a simple head in the sand approach. So basically we're sitting here with a staff that's refused to even consider bike lanes or anything like that for improved biking. That say, well, bicycles shouldn't be on Glebe Road, which is impractical. And basically, I don't think staff is even work with the Bicycle Advisory Committee, which county board said they should. This is because the planning committee should recommend it. We need a comprehensive study on whether we should have parking on Glebe Road, and where you can consider the impact on that. What they're now doing is they're discouraging cycling and encouraging automobile use. That's the present staff policy, the transportation policy. Maybe that's what they want. But I don't see why anyone would add parking to anywhere as if they're trying to make people, have people walk or use metro or anything like this. It's a short-sighted problem. They say to make it like a boulevard or something. It will calm traffic or something. Well, it may calm traffic, but not having the parking and putting a bike lane right next to the sidewalk would also calm traffic. So you need I want like a comprehensive study on the feasibility, on the desirability of putting parking on Glebe Road between Henderson Drive and Fairfax Drive. It's already been done part way, but the biggest projects are yet to come, which is south of Wilson Boulevard.
Thank you, Mr. Byrne.
And our next item is item 2. This is the Transaction Regional Transportation Plan. And we have Keith Jasper here from NVTA to give us an overview.
Good evening. My name is Keith Jasper. I'm principal in charge of transportation planning and programming at the Northern Virginia Transportation Authority. And I'd like to thank the Commission for inviting us here to give you a briefing on Transaction, the long-range regional transportation plan for Northern Virginia. I've got a very short presentation. Please feel free to interrupt as we go, and I'm happy to take any questions that you may have. We have just started a public comment period, and I believe in front of you you have this document, a 12-page document, which is the draft plan, which has been posted for public comment through July 23rd. Also, staff has a copy of a much larger document, which is the project list associated with the plan and which is also subject for public comment at the present time. If you go to our website, there is also an interactive mapping tool to help locate projects on a map basis rather than in a list. I'd like to start with a little bit of history. Just very briefly, the region has prepared long-range transportation plans over the last decade or two, and these are shown on this slide here. I believe you've got this presentation in front of you as well. The most recent plan, Transaction 2040, was adopted in November of 2012 and identified $23 billion worth of projects, capital investments. This plan, Transaction 2040, while it's current, is soon to expire and will be replaced by the update that we're currently working on, which is due to be adopted by the authority hopefully in October of this year. The current plan, Transaction 2040, was adopted in 2012, and in the following year, 2013, the Commonwealth, through House Bill HB 2313, created a funding stream for Northern Virginia to be administered by MBTA and used to fund regional projects that are in the long-range transportation plan, and which has also been subject to an evaluation process which is required only in Northern Virginia, referred to as HB 599. And the authority is required to give priority to select projects that are expected to provide the greatest congestion reduction relative to the cost of the project. Now, we have two funding sources or two funding streams. One, if you look to the circle on the right, one stream is referred to as the 30% local distribution revenue, and the other is the 70% regional revenue fund. And essentially, these two funds were created specifically with two purposes in mind. The red slice of the pie there, the 30% fund, is intended for local distribution by jurisdictions such as Arlington County at their discretion, subject to the requirements of the law, which essentially means this money can be spent on transportation projects in Northern Virginia. So that money MBTA receives from the state and passes straight through to member jurisdictions like Arlington County. The 70% regional revenue, the larger amount of money, is held by MBTA and used to allocate funding to regional projects that are included in our long-range regional plan. So based on the funding we've received since July of 2013, in other words, the fiscal year 2014 year and subsequently fiscal year 15, 16, and 17, so 4 years of funding, we've allocated close to $1 billion worth of funds to regional projects in Northern Virginia, which I recognize you cannot see the specifics of on this graphic, but essentially these are the projects that the money has been allocated to. And for reference, the authority has allocated close to $60 million so far to Arlington with respect to 70% projects, the regional projects. And the county in turn has allocated, by our reckoning, at least $8 million of the 30% funds on projects of its own choosing, such as the three largest ones: Arlington Transit Vehicle Facility, $2.2 million, Capital Bike Share, $1.5 million, and Old Dominion Drive, $1.2 million. Also, for reference, the 57 to 60 million which has been allocated for regional projects include projects such as the new west entrance to Ballston Metro Rail Station, and a number of other projects. And also, in addition to that, the authority has funded power traction upgrades on the Orange Line and the Blue Line, the Envision Route 7 project, which was managed by the Northern Virginia Transportation Commission, which kind of touches the very edge of Arlington County. And also in Alexandria, the West End Transit Way and the Potomac Yard Metro Rail Station, which will hopefully be of benefit to Arlingtonians as well. So that's kind of what we've done so far with the money, and now the point of this evening is to kind of look ahead with where we're going now in terms of funding allocations. So our new plan, when it's adopted, as I mentioned, later this year, this is the first update since the passage of House Bill 2313. So for us, it's a really big deal. And part and parcel of that is we're looking at a lot more projects because we know there's a guaranteed revenue stream at the end of this process. So the draft plan you have before you includes 358 multimodal projects across Northern Virginia, which have been divided up into 11 regional corridors, which in turn have been divided into 28 corridor segments. There's some other information on here, but essentially we're kind of trying to be consistent with the way planning is done within the region, but recognize that what we're doing in Northern Virginia is somewhat different. We have an unconstrained plan, meaning we are looking at the totality of needs, looking at what can be done to address those needs without worrying too much in the first instance at what we can afford. But having said that, we know we can't afford everything that's in the plan, the results of which I'm going to show you. So we're using a performance-based planning approach with 15 weighted measures, with a 45% weighting towards congestion reduction and 55% towards other things. We've also included what we call a scenario or sensitivity analysis, recognizing that our horizon year is 2040, and our crystal ball is not perfect, so we can't be absolutely sure what 2040 will look like today. So we wanted to do some sensitivity analysis as well, just to get an idea of if the future looks different to the plan as we forecasted it, then how robust will our findings be under those different scenarios. So that's something new we've not done before. Don't stare too long at this graphic. You'll kind of go dizzy and fall over. But essentially what we're trying to show here, this is looking out to 2040, looking specifically at commute patterns. And you see, well, hopefully you can see up in kind of like in the 10, 11 p.m. position, an orange chord, which is the Arlington part of this circle. And so the lines coming out of Arlington indicate where people who live in Arlington travel to work. And the other colored lines coming into Arlington are obviously where people indicate where people who live outside of the county come and who work in Arlington. So perhaps not surprisingly, a fair number of Arlingtonians work in Arlington. Obviously, quite a number work in DC and in Fairfax County. You also see quite a lot of people who live in Fairfax County commute to Arlington County, and then a myriad of other lines which show you people coming from all over the region and from other parts of the Commonwealth and other parts of Maryland who work or will be working in 2040 in Arlington. And essentially what this is telling us is we don't have a single problem to fix it. This is a very complex pattern of travel demand, and as a result, we have a very complex plan to address that. But it's understanding this sort of thing is very important to getting the plan right. We've, as I mentioned earlier, we've focused on regional needs using corridors and corridor segments to evaluate groups of projects. This is kind of getting a bit technical. I'm happy to come back to this if you have questions on it. The plan itself, I mentioned, contains 358 projects with an estimated cost of $44 billion. I would note that 10 to $13 billion of that estimated capital cost is associated with project components that are outside of Northern Virginia. So, for instance, a tunnel for Metro Rail into DC, new river crossings of the Potomac outside of the Beltway, and other things that cross the river in general include cost components that Northern Virginia Transportation Authority cannot legally fund because they are outside of Northern Virginia. So we felt it's very important to include those in the plan because they're critical to transportation demand in the region per that earlier diagram I showed you, but we have to recognize that we can't fund everything that's in the plan. Even if we had all of the money, there are some things we legally cannot fund. The project types are very broad-ranging, multimodal. The numbers that you have there add up to more than 358. That's because some projects represent different project types. So there's a certain amount of double counting, both the number of projects and in the total project cost. So turning to the overall impact of the plan, don't focus too much on any of the specifics on here, but just kind of take the general impression. On the left, we have what we call the no build for 2040. This is what conditions will be like in 2040 if we don't do anything other than the projects that are already fully committed and fully funded. This is what 2040 will look like using the 15 weighted performance measures that we used. The central map, that what we call the draft plan, is what changes as a result of the 358 projects. And then the map to the right is showing you in green where things got better and in red where things got worse as a result of the 358 projects. So a lot of green on that right-hand map, but still some red. And if you take a glance at the middle map, you still see some deep purple, blue, dark pink kind of colors, which indicate although things get better, they don't get fixed. So, congestion and the other measures that are taken into account here are a reality, at least based on the projects that have been evaluated within this draft transaction plan. I won't dwell on this, but as I mentioned, we looked at some scenarios, of alternate futures, we call them. The 4 scenarios are listed here, A, B, C, and D. Essentially, we tried to find things that were plausible, but not what we would predict to happen, or certainly not what we would prefer to happen, but things that will stress our analysis to see how robust the analysis is. And essentially, we did actually find that the analysis was pretty robust on the basis that, for the most part, things are forecast to be pretty bad in 2040. So it wasn't difficult to make things better. But there were some important lessons that we learned as well, which I'll come to in just a moment. So some kind of basic findings here, which I won't read, but just wanted to highlight the second bullet in blue. No single project, program, or policy will address all the region's transportation needs. We'd love for there to be a silver bullet out there, but frankly, if there was, you would have found it long ago and fixed it. That is not there. So we need a kind of an all-of-the-above approach to transportation in 2040. For all I've shown you about the impact of the draft plan with 358 projects, we can barely afford, with our projected revenues, the 70% revenues between now and 2040, we can barely afford to fund a quarter of the projects that are in the plan. That's not to say they can't be funded, but they would have to be funded using not just MBTA money, but other sources, including MBTA's 30% revenues. Obviously, that's at the discretion of the jurisdictions, but that's another source. The Commonwealth Smart Scale process also is another source. Federal and other private contributions, whatever. So we're not saying they can't be done. We're just saying it can't be done exclusively with MBTA regional revenues. And the final bullet on this page, emerging trends in technology and travel preferences, perhaps not a silver bullet, but maybe a silver lining. We have found in the scenario analysis that one of our scenarios in particular, the assumptions associated with it, suggests that some of the problems that we forecast to occur in 2040 will be mitigated by our scenario A, which is a very heavily technology-dependent scenario. And so that gave us some encouragement that we may not need to spend 44 or 44 minus $13 billion. It's possible that the future will change in ways that are significant enough to cause some of the funding to no longer be needed. But that's something where it's very early days. We can't make a hard recommendation on that because we simply do not have the data to base any such recommendation on. So just finally, we are looking for public input. We invite the public to go online and through email or through regular mail. The information on how to make public comment is explained more fully on the back page of the document you have in front of you. Staff have copies here which they're keeping in the offices. These are obviously available online as well, and so if anyone needs more hard copy or needs help finding the electronic version, we or county staff would be pleased to help. With that, I'll take any questions you may have.
Great, thank you very much. Mr. Best, do we have any speakers on this item?
We have no speakers for this item.
No speakers for transaction, excellent. So the questions and comments from the commission. Does anybody want to kick off? Commissioner Warren.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a few questions for the speaker. Basically, I'm looking at the cost estimates here, $44 billion. That's the most recent estimate, what you just mentioned, with about $23 billion, a little bit over that, for transit, and then roadway of $19 billion and some other cost items. My question really generally, and I'll elaborate on this, is how dependent are these cost estimates on some key assumptions? For example, in the case of Project 100, I looked at the transaction plan and I found that this is involving Metro Rail fleet expansion. So it would include such things as expansion to 8-car trains, upgrades and replacements of rail car fleet, power stations, power cables, and third rail improvements. Now, in view of the fact that Metro Rail's financial condition is so uncertain, and that the most recent Metropolitan Washington Council of Government reports is shown in the April 27th issue of the Post, shows a shortfall of about $7.5 billion over the next 10 years. Now, some of that shortfall presumably will be covered by the plan. And my question here is, I'm not going to ask you how much because I know that you don't know, but I'm trying to get an idea of just how fungible the plan is if the MWCOG is relying more on NVTA and the Transaction 40 plan or less so. There's certain assumptions that have to be made here about how much money the NVTA will be raising for the purpose of Metro financing in all of its respects, and then how much Metro will be raising. Now, these are fundamental, but I've not heard them discussed. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
I'll try, Commissioner Warren. Thank you for the question. And I should also have stressed earlier that the adoption of transaction doesn't result in any immediate allocation of funds to projects. That's the unconstrained part of the plan. We look at all the needs, we look at all the costs to address those needs, but it's unconstrained. We get to the constrained part through what we call our 6-year program process, which will kick in immediately transactions adopted, which, as I said, will hopefully be in October. And then, so we'll start to allocate funds to projects in about this time next year. That process is yet to happen. But to your question about Metro funding, yeah, obviously we're absolutely aware that Metro has got other priorities and funding constraints right now. The process we go through is that we look at the requests we receive for funding for our 6-year program, and we'll probably be updating this every 2 years. We look at the request, we do an analysis based in part on what's in transaction and in part on what we call congestion reduction relative to cost calculations. And essentially, we look to see how much money we have. We look to see how the projects score. We take into account other considerations that you can't put into a mathematical formula, and the authority makes a recommendation. So the first step would be, as far as Metro is concerned, is Metro, all the member jurisdictions would have to make a request for funding related to Metro Rail. So, and we're too early to be able to figure out, exactly what that would be if it happens. But that would be the first step for us. We estimate for our 6-year program about $1.5 billion available in PAYGO cash revenues over the 6-year period. We also have the ability to use debt finance up to about the same amount, so somewhere in the 1.5 billion ballpark. So we actually have quite considerable financial resources to support the projects that funding is requested for, including Metro. But one of the biggest, well, the biggest project in the list. I'm not sure if it's the one you referred to, but the biggest one that's on the project list is for a new Blue Line alignment from Roslyn to Union Station. Our estimate for that, which was developed in conjunction with Metro, is about $7 billion. But remember also, as I said earlier, that things that are outside Northern Virginia, we can't fund. We're not legally allowed to fund things outside of Northern Virginia. So in order for us to fund that project or any other project like it, Maryland and the district would have to align their resources with ours in order to be able to fund projects of that magnitude. And so it's a difficult thing to predict right now as to whether DC and Maryland will be ready to do that. But that's the process that we would follow when the time comes.
Now, you're talking about the constrained plan here, because I know there is a distinction between that and the unconstrained plan.
When it comes to when it comes to allocating funding, the process I've just outlined is what we would use. That's what we call our 6-year program. Right now, there is no constraint. Cost isn't a reason to exclude any project from the plan.
Is it your understanding that the responsibility lies primarily with Metro in its plan to initiate, to say we're going to spend within that 10-year period, that we have a priority? Rail car replacement, for example, has been a priority, and they're doing that. And then over the next, say, 2 to 3 years, Metro would say X number of dollars on this and upgrades and so on. And then they would say, well, however, beyond that 2 or 3 year period, it's up to NVTA, and we're not too sure what they're going to come up with. Is that something
it's much more collaborative than that. We're not a funding stream to Metro or any other jurisdiction. With respect to the 70% funds, we fund projects with that money. So essentially, MBTA, the Northern Virginia jurisdictions, including Arlington, will work with Metro Rail to figure out, what the priorities were, what could be afforded at what point in time. I don't envision it's something that would need all the funding in one go. So the first step might be to do some preliminary planning and design, and so they could make requests for a small amount of funding first, and then work through the process to develop more detailed plans, and eventually come and ask for construction funding. But Metro Rail couldn't get all of that money from us. They could get some of it from us, but they couldn't get all of it from us.
Okay, another question, a little more manageable here. Another project is identified on as a Project 32, and it talks about either BRT, Bus Rapid Transit, or LRT from Manassas to Dulles parallel to Route 28. And I know that generally the costs vary, but BRT is around a third to a half, depending upon the alignment of LRT. So that's a very expensive project, like rail is anyway. And so my question here is, with a major project like this, when you're talking about either this or that, it puts a lot of doubt into the amount of money. If you're going to have a BRT, for example, there would be a lot less money. And so I just cite this one project, but there are many other expensive projects. How do you account for the uncertainty of that? Because the uncertainty is a major element here.
That's right. For that sort of project, the starting point may be actually to do some detailed study and preliminary engineering, as was done for the Envision Route 7 project from Fairfax through Falls Church, Arlington, Alexandria, to look at exactly what you're talking about, BRT and LRT options. And that project, as I'm sure you know, came up with a BRT solution based on the demand levels that they were expecting, and the kind of the streetscape that they were trying to engineer the solution into. For something along Route 28, it would depend on the availability of land. Land may be more readily available at lower cost, both environmentally and financially. And if the demand is very high, then an LRT solution might be more appropriate in that situation. But obviously a lot of analysis would need to be done at the front end. I don't envision with a project like that, we would start with a request for construction funding. We would start with a request for either a study, or if a study's already been done, some more detailed preliminary engineering and design. So we wouldn't dive straight in with a multi-billion-dollar project.
Another follow-up question on this. That's an interesting point. Does the $44 billion represent the top estimate of these projects? Because it can range, many of them can range, or a middle point? Because generally in forecasting costs, it's wise to say, here's a top estimate if we're going to do this, and here's a middle range of what we think is most likely based on funding and other thing, and then here's a low estimate if we don't get some projects. I don't see that in here. Is that a useful thing, do you think to do?
No, you're quite right. This is what we would call our best estimate, but at the planning level, which recognizes quite an amount of uncertainty in the number. So it gives us what we need for this stage of our work, which is to understand in broad terms what this plan is likely to cost. It doesn't commit anyone to that cost, but it puts things into the right ballpark. When jurisdictions and agencies apply for funding from us as part of our 6-year programming process, they have to come to us with much more detailed cost estimates, and they're the ones that do get locked in. But that's on the jurisdictions and the agencies. It's not on MBTA. We do our due diligence on it, but it's the responsibility of the organization that's requesting the funding to do what you're saying, is to come up with detailed, accurate costs and build in sufficient contingency in that, so that if there are cost overruns, they don't have to come and ask us for more money.
Okay, thank you. That's fine.
So I know our transportation models are always quite good at taking into account the fact that land use affects transportation demand. The more people are living there, the more likely the more demand there's going to be for trips. And when those people are living in dense urban type development, a lot more of that tends to go towards transit, or they bike or walk to where they need to go. Does the modeling here for transaction capture sort of the opposite effect, the fact that the more transportation infrastructure we build, that ends up impacting the land use around that infrastructure? For instance, we're building a highway to an area that's currently very, rural and farms and that sort of thing, and all of a sudden you can get into DC in a much faster way, and so people, start building houses there because all of a sudden it's an attractive place to live, or, we build better transit, so all of a sudden, you can get into DC on transit more, so we end up building up more urban, style of development around that transit facility?
That's a very good question. Clearly there is a linkage between transportation and land use, and clearly there's evidence that you build it and they will come. That said, the modeling approach we're using is built around the MW COGS around 9.0 land use forecast for 2040, and so in a sense, we're mostly locking in the land use, and so the extent to which big transportation projects will change that land use isn't really taken into account, although it is acknowledged. So I think what we've tried to do is give it our best shot at understanding what the problems are forecast to be based on the growth that's forecast. I'm not sure if you're aware, but we're looking at a population increase through 2040 of 24%, and an employment increase, and this is just in Northern Virginia, through 2040 of 37%. And these are huge increases, which will take place on an already very stressed transportation system. And so that's the reality that we're trying to deal with first and foremost. But MBTA doesn't have responsibility for land use planning decisions. That rests with the member jurisdictions. So there's a limit to what we can do. We don't control that. We can't really influence it because we recognize that's a line we don't cross. And so we kind of, we can't really get into that in too much detail, but I would say that 2 of the scenarios that we evaluated were land use-based scenarios, which essentially looked at the growth that's forecast between now and 2040. And what we did is we reallocated that growth away from where COG had placed it. To one extreme, we put more of the growth into the region's activity centers, and to the other extreme, we kind of distributed it away kind of more into a sprawl scenario. And that certainly highlighted that, you know, whichever path you go down causes problems. Even putting more growth in the activity centers causes problems, but they're just different problems to if you put it into a more sprawl environment. But you know, we did our best to try and evaluate those things, but you know, we recognize that it's not perfect.
Yeah, I mean, this is my big concern about HB 599 and about all of this regional planning, is that by going to this scoring system, this makes all of us decision makers, you know, us in an advisory capacity and all of the leaders who are making these decisions feel very good about these decisions. We're picking these transportation projects based on hard data. You know, it's the best bang for the buck. It's the most congestion relief for the buck. But it's in many ways a lie, because that congestion relief that we're measuring is ignoring a huge part of what causes congestion, which is this shift in land use. You know, so we're ignoring the induced demand, the change in land use, the change in demand and transportation that happens as a result of what projects we pick. And so we're never going to see the congestion relief that we're actually showing here, because it will shift the land use. You know, we're ignoring the fact that we've got all this population that we're forecasting coming, we've got all these jobs that we're forecasting coming, and by picking transportation projects one way or another, we can influence where those jobs go. We can influence where that population goes by saying, you know, now it's faster to get here via transit, or now it's faster to get here via road. But we're not thinking that way. We're thinking it's entirely the other direction. We need to look and see where the congestion is and build projects there. So when we're basing scores on a congestion relief measure that is inherently flawed, we're making decisions that we feel very good about that we shouldn't be feeling very good about. And that is my issue with HB 599 and with how we do our transportation modeling. And I'm sure other commissioners have questions or feedback, and then we have much more on our agenda to get to. Commissioner Perez, who does not have a microphone.
Thank you. I actually want to second your point there. There was an interesting article in The Atlantic a few months ago about this very point, which is that if you look at a lot of the way that transportation has been designed over the last 50 years, it shifted a lot of land use out towards suburbs and had a detrimental effect in city centers in many ways. And so I will contest one point, which is that I don't necessarily think it's the job of the modelers to determine the utility function, in a sense. I think it is the job of legislators. And in a lot of ways, if the goal is to decrease congestion, then that's what the modelers are going to model, right? If the goal is to create, you know, more vibrant urban multimodal communities, then that's what will be modeled. And so ultimately, if what we're trying to influence is the way that it's scored, you have to influence the utility function.
Any other commissioner questions or comments on transaction? Commissioner Warren.
Just one other quick question. The last thing that you mentioned, I think on the last page, is very interesting, especially in view of the chairman's comments here about land use. One of the more intriguing things is the automated vehicle, and you mentioned that or suggest that, saying emerging trends in technology and travel preferences may improve conditions. My understanding, having gone to some conferences and read a lot about automated vehicles, is that they will increase the capacity of existing roads. Because you can get them a lot closer together. They'll all be traveling at the same speed, and so you don't get the variation you get with individual drivers. And I'm just wondering, I know you can't model that because you don't know how extensive automated vehicles are going to be in 10 or 15 years, but it could also induce more travel in the sense that it makes highway travel more feasible and faster. And so that raises another interesting issue. Is there any way that you see now to evaluate the benefits and costs, so to speak, I'm using that loosely here, in terms of reduced travel time to automated vehicles versus increased travel the people who are currently taking transit, for example, might now find that individual travel by automated vehicles is better for them.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right that there are many things that could happen, and the reality is we just don't know at this moment in time. We don't know what the consumer interest will be in terms of actually buying either that sort of vehicle or buying mobility services using that sort of vehicle. We don't know exactly what will happen with regard to people's willingness to maybe share ownership of a vehicle or to share the use of a vehicle in the future. There are a lot of uncertainties there. So what we have said in the document is that MBTA should take the responsibility to monitor these sorts of emerging trends and report back to the authority on an annual basis for the very specific reason to ensure that if we begin to see trends occurring that are going to lead to investment obsolescence, or indeed if we begin to see trends occurring which would lead to more sprawl or more vehicle miles traveled, that we also identify and report back on that. Beyond that, the rest is not much more than informed speculation. It could go in many different directions. One of the things which did excite us about the possibility is that a huge amount of the congestion that we experience in the region is as a result of unplanned events like crashes and weather, big concerts, whatever. I mean, they may be planned, but they may be unusual in terms of regular traffic patterns. And so the congestion related to those sorts of things, what we call non-recurrent congestion, it could be substantially mitigated by these technologies in particular, but crashes being the biggest one of all. If you can avoid or greatly reduce the number of crashes due to human error, which this technology promises, then that alone is going to have a huge impact. But beyond that, how it will change people's travel patterns, whether people will be prepared to sit in their vehicle working for 2 hours and living in West Virginia because they can. I mean, it's possible, but we have no way of knowing at this moment in time. But we do recognize the importance of monitoring that on a regular basis. I mean, during the course of transaction, we've seen over just the last 24 months how this market has evolved and changed from what we thought when we started. And it's unlikely that it's going to slow down the rate of change. But we just don't know what the end point is going to be and when it will be here.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Jasper.
Thank you.
Our next item is item 3, the VRE Crystal City Station improvements. This item is public comment, which we currently have 10 speakers for. And at our last meeting, we had VRE staff give us a very comprehensive overview of their planning study for this item. And also, we will be adding a special meeting on September 13th to address this item before it goes to the county board, I believe on September 16th. So with that, this is really to collect public comment. This was open at our last meeting for public comment. However, we did not receive any, and we thought this would allow time for speakers to come out. I'll let everyone know that this is being recorded. It's also being broadcasted on Arlington County cable and also on the county website, but it's also being digitally recorded. So there'll be an icon, so this can be played back basically about 48 hours after this meeting. And I'll call the speakers in order that I receive them. Our first speaker is Curtis Bedke, followed by Susan Goodfellow. And we'll adjust this to 5 minutes.
Okay, great. Good evening. My name is Kurt Bedke. I'm the Vice President of the Crystal Gateway condominium at 1300 Crystal Drive at the far north end of Crystal Drive, and I'm speaking on behalf of our Board of Directors. First, I want to thank you for hearing that we are concerned and for adding this public speaker forum to this meeting. We do appreciate it. I've lived in 3 locations along Crystal Drive over the past 25 years. Twice, I've lived in the Water Park Towers building that is the closest to the current VRE station. I can tell you from personal experience that it is loud. Do you learn to live with it? Sure you do. But you don't learn to love it, and you can't learn to ignore it. Believe it or not, after all these years, the airplanes you can learn to ignore. The train with its stopping and starting, well, you never do. If you love Crystal City for all of its positives, as I do, you keep coming back. And like so many military who've lived there while serving, you even eventually retire here. And if you believe in your county government, as I do, you figure that everything gets better and eventually they'll be able to fix that. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that time has arrived. And to combine Charlie Brown and David Bowie, you can be goats or you can be heroes. You have the opportunity to dramatically improve the single greatest irritant to living in this otherwise wonderful area, the train noise. Or you can again let a train station be built right dead center behind a residential building and deeply upset a community that knows there is a solution that solves this problem. Now, it's clear to us that the VRE has created an analysis that fits a predetermined solution, option 2, and it does so in a way that insultingly told the community's residents that they actually have no concerns, rating community and environmental impacts across the board as even was ludicrous. Telling us that there's no noise difference is patently absurd. These people behind me are not here because there are no impacts. Now, you've figured out that this is an issue that has generated deep anger and resentment among those who live along Crystal Drive. This is a community that is supporting each other and will continue to push for the option that provides improved service for the VRE commuters, improved access to the businesses and the commerce that they frequent, and much improved quality of life for the residents who actually live here, who are counting on you. The boards of directors of the Crystal Drive condominiums have put each other on speed dial on this issue. We are in sync. I'm from Crystal Gateway across from option 1. We could look at your option 2 solution and smile smugly to ourselves and walk away. But we will not, because the process has been so wrong, the priorities have become so skewed, and especially because we support the rest of our fellow residents in pushing what is the right answer for Crystal City, option 3. Contrary to what you may assume, we do not oppose progress. We embrace it. We are not Luddites or geezers who want to keep things the way they've always been. We are doctors, lawyers, military leaders, diplomats, business and government executives. We have visions of what Crystal City can be, if only you'll see past the narrow view of distance to the metro and think bigger, think grander. Think of this as creating the Crystal City destination community of the future and not merely the Crystal City train stop en route to other places. You're a transportation committee, I get that, but this isn't just a network hub. This is our community. So look, you can give the VRE commuters the service they want. In fact, option 3, I understand I have extra time, 2 more minutes, right? I have 5, good. Okay. In fact, option 3 puts most of the commuters who by and large walk closer to their destinations. The bus riders will have the closest bus stop of all 3 options, and that small percent who take the metro will still have but a short walk. With option 3, you know that within 1 year, no VRE commuter will even notice the difference, but that with that option, you will have endeared yourselves to this community and solved a problem we've been desperate to have solved, a solution that we know you can solve. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Mr. Bedke.
And our next speaker is Susan Goodfellow, followed by Krista Alt.
Good evening, Commissioners. I didn't plan to talk tonight, so my comments may be a little disjointed. I apologize for that in advance. I do NEPA for a living, or at least a big part of my job involves NEPA. And so I just want to encourage you, as you look at this project in the future and make your own comments, that I see some potential concerns relative to segmentation, that this project, although it has some independent utility for solving a problem that some of the trains don't currently fit on the platform, that it's really very much motivated by their 2040 plan and the increase in train traffic that's anticipated. And so to not feature that as part of their analysis, I think is a big fault of the analysis done so far. The criteria that they've applied, it's very unclear how those criteria are weighted, how they actually applied the criteria to get their red, green, yellow. They're using the criteria to narrow down to a single option to analyze in their NEPA document. I would very strongly encourage you to support the idea that they analyze all three of the options in their environmental documentation. They should be looking at a range of alternatives. There actually are some nuanced differences between those alternatives that would come out if they analyze all of them. I do not think that they've adequately covered a clear baseline that they can then compare to what the conditions will be at the time that their station is actually constructed. So given their current planning and the fact that they haven't secured funding for the project yet, this won't probably be implemented or constructed until 2021, 2022. Right now, none of their study about conditions at the time are based on what the projections are going to be for noise levels, for transportation levels in 2021. They're doing their evaluation strictly on what the conditions are right now, and actually most of their data points are from 2016 or 2015. So I see that as a fault that they need to look for. And then the larger issue is cumulative impacts. There are a lot of projects that are being proposed along that line, not the least of which is the Long Bridge project. Those two are very much dependent on each other. The changes that VRE is going to do for both Crystal City and L'Enfant Plaza have to be tied together with the Long Bridge project, because the Long Bridge project has to tie into both of those stations. And there was no mention of the Long Bridge project at all in any of the public meetings for the VRE station. So with that, I'll close. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Goodfellow.
Our next speaker is Krista Alt, followed by Arthur Purcell.
Good evening, everyone. Chris Strahl, President of the Crystal City Civic Association. Somehow, the county board has decided that even though the concerns of the Crystal City residents regarding a VRE station relocation are not primarily related to technical transportation issues, 2 hearings with this commission are the only opportunities we are being offered to express our views prior to the county board decision-making session in September. Apart from a refusal to offer us a direct dialogue with county board or staff until this point, it seems that the, for us, obvious venue for our broad concerns and issues, namely the Planning Commission, is not available to us either. The contrast with the full SPRC process for a new building or the PFRC process for a county facility is rather telling. So this is why we now put faith in your willingness to listen to the whole gamut of concerns and to grapple with both non-transportation aspects and the basic issue of county disregard for the quality of life of our residents. Plainly, we need your support for the unified view of the residents that a railway station is not the kind of infrastructure with all its access issues and environmental impacts which one places flush against a pair of residential buildings as under option 1 or 2, when there is a perfectly good option 3, placing it in the back of office buildings a mere 400 feet away. Ironically, this means that instead of seeing you getting down into the weeds to try to determine minuscule access-related differences between options, we need for you to do just the opposite and appreciate that these differences are so negligible and even contradictory that they do not in any way justify that the very basic quality of life argument should be dismissed. We fully appreciate and support the notion of transit connectivity. For instance, we are totally in favor of choosing an option which facilitates a pedestrian bike connection from Crystal City to the airport via a relocated station, not so much for our sake, but for attracting more business, more visitors involving the airport. This is vital from an economic and developmental standpoint, and fortunately, it does make option 3 perfectly feasible. We also generally appreciate the notion of facilitating the transfer to other modes of transportation for VRE passengers. However, we underscore what is openly stated by both VRE and Country, namely that only 18% of passengers actually continue on Metro Rail. More than 60% happily walk to their destinations within Crystal City, predominantly to points south, something which perfectly fits option 3. And I should add that we are also aware that the new major landowner in Crystal City, JBG, would also accept option 3 as the alternative. Most of the rest of the VRE passengers use Metroway bus to go some short distance north or south, and this proportion is likely to increase. One of the Metroway bus stops is exactly at the location for option 3. As regards Pentagon workers, many often prefer to walk, but the key here is that they should be fully supported by our already existing Art Bus 92, so the precise VRE station location should be a non-issue for them. Accordingly, we are frustrated and even upset by the county's apparent determination to pursue option 2 only, regardless of the basic community concerns, on account of their desire, I would even say obsession, about ensuring the absolutely shortest route for the modest number of VRE passengers using Metro Rail. Under option 3, the walk to a new metro entrance at 18th and Crystal would be the same as the brief walk from the current VRE station to the current metro entrance. It would be ludicrous to suggest that the current VRE passenger in Manassas or Fredericksburg would decide to abandon VRE because the walk was not made 400 feet shorter. Finally, some of you might be aware of the current state of the intersection of 18th and Crystal Drive. Even the VRE presenters have confessed their awareness of the horrible and dangerous situation there during rush hour. The flow of Crystal Drive is complicated by the semi-dedicated bus lane, the placement of a busy bus stop right after the intersection, the trailhead for the Mount Vernon Trail, and the already heavy flow of pedestrians and bikers, both workers and residents. Many of the issues are related to poor and not easily remedied implementation of the transitway. This is the last place where we need a new rush hour stream of people cutting across the traffic, as would happen under option 2. This influx fits much better at the location of option 3. Thank you for your attention, and I remain at your disposal until your September 13 meeting. And I think both you and your colleagues absent tonight already have an electronic version of my notes. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. All, and thank you again for submitting your comments in advance. It's very helpful.
Our next speaker is Arthur Purcell, followed by Tonya Giannani.
Well, I'm the anticlimax, I guess. I'm 10 years out of practice giving these sort of presentations, and my eyesight is bad, so forgive me. I'll just try to emphasize the points I submitted in written form, and hopefully when you're making a decision, you could read them. The additional details I wanted to add was in regard to option 2. There seemed to be the impression that there was a roadway behind our 1801 and 1805. If you remember the 3 pictures, at option 1 and option 3, there's a roadway between the building abutting and the train tracks. There is none behind 1801 and 1805. My suggestion would be to have the fire marshal's office weigh in on this, because it would seem to be putting a railroad station where someone might have to be removed by the rescue service, or there may be a fire, in an inaccessible position where fire and rescue people cannot get to the injured or endangered people. This would, it seems like a no-brainer question, and I can imagine what the answer would be. Further, at the meeting yesterday, when I think it was Mr. Dorsey tried to bring up stuff about sound mitigation, It was like, you know, sound mitigation? What? But again, I believe Arlington County has substantial experience with the sound barriers along Route 66. I was happy to see them, and perhaps you could share your experience or impose some requirements if they want to try to push option 2, because you have to realize the horn blasts are sounded within feet of people's bedrooms. It's not yards or hundreds of yards, it's feet. And it's a 100 decibel blast that only decreases to 70 decibels a quarter of a mile away. And in the morning, I'm a night person, so the morning frightens me. But between 6 a.m. and 9 a.m., with the current schedule, there are 1,400 decibel horn blasts when the trains leave the station. This is distinguishable from the arrival problem. But again, I wanted to put that picture in your mind, 100 decibel blasts 28 times a day. And they are promising us more trains. And it's right behind our building, abutting. There's no road, there's no sound control, nothing like that. And I'm out of time, and I finished what I wanted to say. The written thing covers it probably more intelligently, but you know, thank you. Thank you very much.
Our next speaker is Tanya Giannotti, followed by Carol Fuller.
Hi, thank you. I'm Tanya Giannoni. I'm the Vice President of the Board of Directors of the Crystal Park Unit Owners Association. Personally, I use and believe in public transit. I use it daily. I've lived or worked in Arlington County since 2001. And on a daily basis, I actually work similar to you are here in terms of inclusive and evidence-based decisions. So in that spirit, I offer these considerations. My neighbor kind of suggested, I mean, we live literally on top of option 2. It is a mere 20 feet. And actually the garage, 0 feet. So this is a concern, and as our neighbors suggested, there is the notion of how we can actually improve our situation. So we are 181 units, 250 residents. To date, the consultation process with VRE has been disheartening at best. We've been belittled as suggesting it's not in our backyard, and that's not really our perspective. So I really have 4 questions that I would like you to consider as you advance. First, ask yourself, how can this project be a win-win-win-win? Okay, there are 4 sets of stakeholders. The first, and I'm going to go in the order that they seem to be perceived as being considered. The first are the VRE. It is a commuter rail. It's about bringing commuters to Crystal City or perhaps the DC. And they want to expand their operations. Great. But why not expand where they can actually expand transit beyond Metro? Why is there a fixation on the connection by merely feet to the Metro? Why not consider servicing their customers who prefer to walk when they get off? 60% of them do. And that suggests option 3. Furthermore, the business districts more of the growth is in the south of the stations, therefore option 3. County officials, you have stewardship of public resources, improving economic activity. Wouldn't it be better to be next to an office building for commuters? Wouldn't it be better to consider where the commercial district is being built? And then finally, considering us as citizens, which to this point we've not been necessarily considered. Okay, the third stakeholder, VRE riders, they want to walk to their final destination. They don't really want to make a combination. So wouldn't it be better to service those 60% with option 3? And then finally, the women, men, and children that live on Crystal Drive, more than 1,000 residents and voters. And we win because of option 3, as my neighbors have already suggested, because it actually improves our living conditions. So that was the first question. How can you get a win-win-win? Option 3. Not the other options. Ask also, why not expand where public transit reaches? Option 3 gets it closer to the underserved area, away from the Metro. It also improves the connection to the airport. VRE is suggesting that a tunnel is good going to National Airport. I actually walk to the airport when I go, because it's actually faster than taking the metro. It's a 10-minute walk. But as a woman, I don't feel comfortable walking through the tunnel that currently exists. I walk across the bridge. I'll even do it at 11 p.m. at night. And the station of option 3 actually puts you closer to that bridge. So I don't understand that argument. So that was the second one. The third one is, why do we have to have a project that negatively impacts us? Why do we have to choose that solution? Options 0, 1, and 2 present health effects. They present the vibration and the sound. And I think what's been not discussed to date is actually the effect associated with CSX and Amtrak. They use the station, okay? A picture yesterday, if you want to see it, their locomotive will sit and idle at the station. And the proposal of option 2 will have CSX idling basically 0 feet from our property line and 20 feet from bedrooms. So the fourth question to ask yourself is, how can you actually move this project forward without opposition? I think further studies are obviously necessary. My colleagues, my neighbors have already suggested that. There's the option to consider the win-win-win, and then also to consider the number of people affected. And you know, in 4 days, we've gotten 252 people to sign a petition, and we haven't even begun to mobilize. So I do think that we need to be considered, and we were really kind of, as my neighbors suggested, hoping that you do. And if you want to see some of the pictures of exactly, if you haven't been on site, it's a concern. We know we live by the rails, but there's a difference between having a locomotive sitting in your dining room and having it not. So, thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Giannotti.
Our next speaker is Carol Fuller, followed by Dave Salmon.
Good evening. I am a condo owner in Waterford House at the northern part of Crystal City and an officer in the Civic Association, for full disclosure. I would like to address quality of life issues for Crystal City residents that we urge you to consider, not just the transportation issues. And I wish to make 2 points this evening. First, residents of Crystal City, as the previous speaker said, are united that option 3, surrounding commercial buildings, is best for Crystal City. This location would have the least impact on quality of life for residents, as it would place the station around commercial, not residential buildings, thereby mitigating noise and pollution. It would be best for commercial interests, putting the 2 exits close to the largest concentration of VRE riders walking to jobs, close to all transportation options, and close to the major shopping and restaurant areas of Crystal City. And from a safety perspective, it would avoid adding to an already existing overload and traffic hazards at 18th and Crystal Drive if option 2 were chosen. Second point, an upgraded VRE station is our only hope for solving the serious train horn noise problem in Crystal City. This is a major quality of life issue for residents, as previous speakers have said. Tom Hickey of VRE yesterday acknowledged that the Crystal City station is unique in that it is the only one in the VRE system located so close to residential properties. This is an important distinction. VRE did a noise study of its own trains as they passed the 3 proposed locations. This is good for VRE trains which blow their horns leaving the station. We know this now, but they say little impact. But the biggest noise problem is not with the VRE trains, but the CSX train horns coming into the VRE station. For example, on Monday, a CSX engineer blew his horn not twice, but 6 times with a loud blat that almost knocked me off of my balcony. Some of the Crystal City residents negotiated the first deal with CSX in 2014 to not blow horns when the VRE station is closed. So we know there is flexibility in CSX's policies. CSX told us then they were worried about the VRE station not having sufficient security and warning mechanisms. Obviously then, the solution is to put into the upgraded VRE station the appropriate measures that would allow CSX to again be flexible in modifying its policies. We appreciate the county and VRE lawyer Steve McIsaac has been working with CSX and VRE on this issue, and we offer the help of residents and the Crystal City Civic Association to weigh in with CSX as needed to get a win-win situation. In conclusion, we ask you to consider the people issue, not just the transportation options. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Fuller.
Our next speaker is Dave Solomon, followed by Taylor Launch.
Good evening. My name is Dave Salmon. My wife and I own a condominium at 1300 Crystal Drive, which is the building that our president spoke about a minute ago. About 3 years ago, I appeared before the Arlington County Board when they were debating the municipal noise ordinance. Ahead of the debate on that, I read a little bit about the documents and the problems that they were talking about. And I found that in the preamble to the noise, to the municipal noise proposals, there was a disclaimer. And it stated that Arlington County was preempted by federal law from dealing with certain noise issues. Among them were airports and military installations were also in there. But it specifically mentioned railroad noise. Well, I was a little curious about that, so I went back and I did my research. I looked through Title 49 of the United States Code. I'm sure all of you are very familiar with that, and the Code of Federal Regulations. And in Title 49 of each of those two, there are two circumstances where communities can't interfere with air horn noise. One of them is at grade crossings. Well, we don't have any of those in Arlington. And the second case is in the issues dealing with the safety of railroad workers. I was just sad to hear on the news today that apparently 2 railroad workers were killed at Union Station, and I don't know the details, maybe some of you do better, but one apparently stepped off of a freight train and was hit by an Amtrak train coming the other way, I don't know. But the safety of railroad workers is paramount to me. My grandfather was one of them. Now, the attorney for the county, Mr. McIsaac, and I was glad to see him last night, he came back with the point of view that, well, railroad companies have to have operating manuals, and as such, that is, and his words were the fact that CSX has to have a manual to describe when they blow their horns, that's, quote, tantamount to federal preemption. I just told him I thought that was a very, very liberal definition of I talk faster here, I got more to say. It's time to bring, okay, here quickly, I hope you'll give me another minute. The railroad was built in the 1850s. That was the Buchanan administration for people who like to tag history that way. And in those days, the trains did the only thing they could do. They blew their whistle a mile out of town. They didn't have internet connections and fiber optics and satellites and GPS systems. Here we are 165 years later, and nothing has changed. And it's time to drag CSX kicking and screaming into the 21st century and compel the use of high technology and infrastructure changes to mitigate and abate air horn noise in Crystal City. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Taylor Launch, followed by Ernest Fissette.
Sorry, can you give me that name one more time, Mr. Best?
Yeah, I have it down as Taylor Launch.
Yep.
Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Taylor Launch. I work for the JBG Companies, the company that will be merging with Vornado Charles E. Smith to form the landlord entity in Crystal City. I submitted an information package to you all last night, so please let me know if I can resubmit that to you all and if that would be helpful. I'd like to echo the concerns of a lot of the speakers tonight in that noise is important, and noise is an important factor in any of the location options. When we, as a landlord, evaluate this important decision, we do factor in a couple of other items as well. We start to think about what is best for current Crystal City as well as future Crystal City. When you think about current Crystal City, we think a lot about which location offers proximity to the largest number of existing employees, which we believe option 2 does. We also think about which option provides the strongest connection to all of the modes of transportation, with option 2 providing the closest location to both the current and proposed future metro station. It's future Crystal City that we spend most of our time thinking about at JBG and Charles E. Smith. When we look at a future Crystal City, we think about the wonderful assets that Crystal City has today and its adjacency to rail and adjacency to Washington Reagan Airport. And we believe that both of those adjacencies provide a fantastic opportunity for Crystal City and for Arlington to create a true multimodal regional hub. Option 1, when you look at it, seems very far away from the majority of the density that we have today, provides for weaker connections to existing transportation infrastructure, and seems sort of out of place in that it is generally focused in a much more residential area of Crystal City. When you look at option 2 and 3, both of those options provide a fantastic opportunity in that there's the potential connect to one of our buildings, 2011 Crystal Drive, to create a true built train station experience for both VRE and future riders. The main difference that we see between option 2 and 3 is, again, that potential direct connection to Metro, the future Metro station. When we think about the ability to sell to other transit operators a multimodal regional hub, other operators such as Amtrak, MARC, and Reagan Airport, we think of it as much more of a binary outcome, where we are either able to pitch to these providers the most optimum scenario or a suboptimum scenario. And as the landlord, we do hope to be able to come to those agencies with the best selling case possible, and we think that that connection to Metro is a very important piece of that selling case. And for that reason, we are in favor of option 2. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Launch.
Our next speaker is Ernest Fissette, followed by Susan English.
Okay, thank you very much for this opportunity. I want to make 2 quick points. Most of what I was going to say has been covered by previous speakers, but I think it's good to emphasize a couple of things very quickly. There's been some comments that the analysis done by VRE on the 3 sites was flawed in a number of ways. I want to point out 2 things to you. I remember the story. The noise testing was done at a 1/2 mile distance on average from the center point of the 3 proposed stations. That might work, and I think the results were fundamentally that the noise levels are neutral, or it's not going to be substantially different than what there is today. I think what's fundamentally different is we've got 3 main condominiums, and I'm a resident of Crystal Gateway, Water Park Towers, and Crystal Park, that are right there parallel within 100 feet or less of the train tracks. So the difference in option 3, which is only bordered by office buildings and commercial, versus the residents that are affected by 1 and 2 is night and day. So that analysis saying that noise was neutral didn't make a lot of sense to me, and I don't think it would to you when you think of that impact. Second thing real quick, option 1 talks about having a north exit or a north access and entrance that would come out right at the Long Bridge Park, where you walk down through that nice area there. To me, that makes no sense from an investment perspective, because there's nothing there. Potentially, people might walk maybe to the new Boeing building, or they could walk, and there's a lot of thought that people today walk over to the Pentagon. Well, I'm sure they do. The difference, the delta in distance of coming out where you come out today or where you would come out with option 3, if you are a walker to go to the Pentagon, is insignificant. And of course, there's options to take buses and other kinds of transportation. So as someone has said earlier, the win-win situation has got to be option 3. It has a less impact on the residents. And frankly, as you look at the development expectations for Crystal City in the future of the growth and so forth, it's going to be in that southerly direction. And so a station that can serve more broadly that longer-term picture, which is option 3, or potentially even further south, but let's stick with option 3 as being the most relevant to what would serve the future growth of the whole area. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Fissette.
Our next speaker is Susan English, followed by Stephen Miller.
Good evening. I live in Arlington Ridge, so I'm not directly affected by the location of the station, but I'm here because I have been upset by the process and disappointed with what the county has chosen to do. The preceding speakers, with one exception, have been so eloquent in support of option 3 that I simply want to endorse what they've said. What I'm here to say is that if Arlington County has strong reasons why it prefers a location 400 feet closer to the metro entrance for the 18% of riders currently transferring from VRE to metro, and they know this directly affects the quality of life of residents, then they owe residents a full public explanation of those reasons. If, for example, they wish to promote a metro connection to the RB corridor where empty office space is plentiful, they need to say that to the residents. If, for example, they want to make Metro Rail appear more viable to support funding for it, then they need to say that. Everyone knows that Metro needs a sales tax increase to support its future operations. Selling that is going to be a big job. I've been riding on Metro since it was first put in, and I rode streetcars in Washington back in 1948. So I've been watching transportation for a long time in this area. My disappointment with the county process has been that they said VRE was in charge. VRE said the county was in charge. The county needs to just step up and be accountable. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. English.
Our next speaker is Stephen Miller.
Hi, my name is Stephen Miller, and I'm a current resident of Crystal Gateway and a former resident of Crystal Park, and an even farther out resident, former resident of Crystal Plaza. So I have experience in each one of the areas where the stations are being considered. I'm also trained as a urban planner, and I currently function as an environmental lawyer and a expert in environmental conflict resolution. So I would like to urge and recommend that the environmental assessment consider a range of reasonable alternatives and not just focus on one preferred option if it turns out that that's being considered, and that it also look at the impacts of the growth of the community resulting from increased train usage of the station platforms as it might affect the impacts on residential communities and retail, possible growth in retail, and impacts on recreational uses. And lastly, I think it's very important from an ECCR or environmental conflict and collaboration perspective that whatever happens, that an effort be made to engage the community in a collaborative effort so that the community, the businesses, and the government and the planners can understand each other's points of view more and learn to trust each other and maybe learn from each other in what they are thinking. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Miller.
And that concludes our speakers for this item.
Great. Thank you very much. I just want to speak very quickly to everybody. This has been extremely useful. Thank you to every single one of you who came out. Thank you to every single one of you who spoke. These are issues that would not have come to our attention otherwise. These are questions that we have to bring back to VRE for clarification, to the county for additional information, and will definitely be taken into account as we continue to come up with a recommendation for the county board. So I'm sure we will hear from you again, some of you again in September, and we will be continuing to engage on this issue and look forward to, I agree, hopefully trying to come up with a win-win situation for everybody that makes Crystal City better in every way. Thank you very much.
Yeah, we have questions. I do. I have some questions here. Can we ask questions?
I think the commission will take a 5-minute break before our next item.
I guess not. I have some questions on this, on the orange issue. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if Vieri came last time. When Vieri came last time is when we get to.
Yeah, well, this,
Probably will
they
again
raised
when
an
it
issue
comes back.
that I would ask you, because I know that freight railroads are negotiating.
I know, I wanted to be here for it. Realize there'd be this big crowd, but,
That's good, that's a good point. If we need a laser. Wait, yeah.
oh, does this go?
So then I can just boo with a mouse, like, yeah, that's what she was just saying. Yeah, I will.
This is your marked one. I'm just gonna leave it here.
That's all right.
Perfect.
Yep.
thought I had this. I have this? Oh, in color too?
And then this shows
This is the one that's closest to the airport, but there's some kind of tunnel over there.
You have no sympathy for the trees that die.
Yeah.
How many trees have died? You know, that's what I want to know. For
Only the trees that were made for the
All right, Mr. Best, we are ready when you are.
Our next item is item 4, the Century Center site plan. This is a site plan action. I'll turn it over to the applicant for a presentation.
Thank you and good evening. My name is Michael Granger. I'm with Low Enterprises, the applicant. I'm going to be just quickly going over a summary of our project and then pass it off to Matt Gelter. He's with Cooper Carrier Architect. He will be going over some of the improvements that we are looking to do, including some improvements of the pedestrian space, removal of curb cuts, and some unplanned open space that he's going to go into further. And I'm going to pass it off to Dan Van Pelt with Grove Slade, and he's going to talk about some of our multimodal study results. So this is what we call the Century Center residential project. We're located at the corner of 23rd Street and Crystal Drive. Next slide. It's right here at the corner where the Buffalo Wild Wings is. They're always intended, when the entire structure was originally built, intended to have a tower at that corner. That tower was never built. We're proposing to build a 24-story, 302-unit apartment building. With the original construction, the garage was built to also accommodate parking for that future building. So we're not proposing to build or create any new parking spaces. We're actually utilizing the existing parking that's already existing in that garage. We are proposing 242 parking spaces at a 0.8 parking ratio. Next slide. So again, this is just a slide from the Crystal City sector plan to give some context of what is envisioned at that corner with the Crystal City sector plan. We are going for the maximum height, 250 feet, but we will not be building out all the way to the corner of Crystal Drive, and Matt will get into that a little bit later with the proposed open space that we have. Next slide. Again, just a zoomed in shot of the corner at 23rd and Crystal Drive. And that is currently our first floor plan. We're moving from left side of the page to the right. There's the existing extension of the Crystal City Underground, which will remain and be there post-construction of the residential building. There are some deep internal retail spaces that right now are kind of cut off and landlocked, don't have a presence on 23rd Street, which we will be improving upon. There currently exists another garage entrance right on at 23rd Street between the two retail spaces. Then the large retailer at the corner, and then moving down south on the page, another retailer. There's a garage ramp off Crystal Drive that will remain, as well as the existing loading dock, and that will be shared between the new residential tower and the existing office tower. Next slide. And this is just another shot of that same plan, but sort of giving context where we'll have the loading. We'll actually be enlarging the loading dock, making it deeper. The garage ramp as well will be extended, mostly for creating some clear height to allow handicap van parking and having that more accessible. And we'd be removing the 23rd Street ramp. So we'll be removing that curb cut, and that will be where our residential lobby is. And I'll pass it off to Matt.
Thanks. No worries. Yes. Actually, if you could go back 2 slides to the existing, just to start. One more. Just for reference, one of the large improvements we're doing is along 23rd Street, where we're getting rid of a vertical circulation block and a vertical circulation stair and elevator that protrudes into the sidewalk, and also the ramp that Mike alluded to. And if we go to the proposed on the next, you can see that we're replacing that with daylighted street front, reducing a curb cut and doing a residential lobby. So we're really looking to activate that 23rd street corridor, as well as to the right where we have the existing open space that exists. We're looking to try to activate that with some improvements per the next slide. And this is an overall showing what we're envisioning for the project, integrating some seating, built-in, some flexible spaces, some additional trees along the Crystal Drive plaza, and also introducing some trees along 23rd Street. And then above, even though it's not transportation, dealing with creating a new courtyard where the second floor existing is, which is not only just for the residents, but a visual improvement to all the neighboring neighbors for their views from apartments and office. Right here we have the existing curb cuts, and then the proposed are similar, except for the improvements along Crystal Drive and the tree plantings along 23rd. And next slide. The next three are just visuals of the projects. We're looking to do out of a squat footprint of an existing tower, creating some verticality and interest at the corners. We're trying to join the residential with the retail below and really activate that with a lot of glass. Create something dynamic that we're very proud of and think works really well at this very busy intersection and corner. Next slide. We also, to create some more vertical elements of the glassy, we're doing a secondary skin of brick and punched windows towards the courtyard to have a difference in material and also make it feel a little more slender and elegant. And our last slide, and this would be the view looking north up Crystal Drive with our you would see right there the loading dock and the garage entry remaining to the left, but really being dressed up to tie into the residential tower as well as the new retail and sort of revitalizing this whole as one project. And I believe that's it for the architectural. So now I'll be passing this over to Grove Slade to talk about transportation. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Dan Van Pelt with Grove Slade. I'm going to talk to you a bit about our transportation review that we performed for this project. We had initially performed a transportation impact study, and then staff came back and asked us to do a bit more multimodal review, which we've done. And so I'm going to largely focus on that this evening. I think at this point you're probably all pretty aware of where the site is located, the corner of 23rd and Crystal Drive. We're between about a quarter mile and a half mile to the metro station, about a 10-minute walk. If you could back up one slide for just a moment. We have several bus stops that are immediately in the vicinity of the site. They're blue on this map. The Metroway is shown by the blue lines that go up Crystal Drive and then back down Clark. And we also have the underground, which is immediately, which we connect to immediately across the street. There is a Capital Bike Share station that is right there on 23rd Street. So continue on with bike infrastructure, bicycle infrastructure. The next slide, please. There are existing bike lanes on Crystal Drive and South Clark Street. There's the buffered and the protected facilities that are on South Eads. There are designated routes on 23rd and South Fern. The Mount Vernon Trail and the 4-mile run are in the vicinity. And there's also 5 other bike share stations that are within a quarter mile. So going to the transportation impact analysis, and the first analysis focused on the vehicular capacity analysis, looking at the intersections. The intersections we looked at, there were 14 of them that they're shown here, the dots on this image. There are 3 locations where we're operating at unacceptable levels of service today. Those are shown with the red and the yellow dots. The 300 additional dwelling units, when you look at the vehicular trips that would generate, it's a relatively low number. When we add that to the network, we're not really seeing any noticeable increase in delay with those vehicular trips added to the network. There will be a TDM plan to encourage the alternate uses, the alternate modes, and take advantage, certainly in Crystal City, where there are quite a number of them. So the TDM coordinator, the ACCS contribution, and then the standard package of TDM commitments that we expected in the county. We did look at things to kind of tease out the trip generation a little bit more. We looked at it, focused first on the auto, but looked at it by mode. We looked at it and determined the mode splits based on the Crystal City sector plan multimodal analysis that was done. We've looked at some more recent data, and it still seems that applies. We're looking at a 35% auto, and then it breaks down into the other modes. If you go to the next slide, please. And I think that this seems to, this still agrees and is kind of validated with some of the information that was produced for the 22202 study, which showed, it's hard to read on this slide, but there's 34% drive alone in the Crystal City area. The county overall is about a 51%. I believe that number is up on the pie chart that's up in the upper right-hand corner. Looking at the pedestrian infrastructure, kind of zooming in a little bit more around the site, walk score gives the site a good walk score. The sidewalks, if you look around the adjacent, around the site itself, the infrastructure doesn't really show a whole lot of deficiencies. Where we do see them is where these locations where you start to see some of the sidewalks don't meet kind of the minimum criteria, where they're noted here in yellow, or we've got some crosswalks where, or maybe some curb ramps where we don't, we're really not up to current standards with those. Those are noted in yellow. The ones that are right across the street from the site on 23rd Street, I mean, a lot of that are things that will be taken care of with future improvements per the sector plan on 23rd Street. But there's no immediate deficiencies immediately around the site. We did look at bus data. What this shows is the bus stops in the vicinity. This information came from the county. Of course, Metroway, I think, would be expected, has the highest boardings and lightings, and those are the green dots that you would see. The data that we got from the county shows that, I think also we expect that the Metroway ridership is continuing to increase, and I think, as people are beginning to use that service more and more. The Metro capacity, we did look at what is the activity that is at the Metro station. One thing that's interesting, and some of this we borrowed from the 2222 study again, is that the usage of the Metro station really peaked back in 2010, 2011 timeframe, and has dropped off a bit since then. And you can see that on the figure that's here off to the right. I think in terms of how this project could impact the Metro station, while there's been that decrease in utilization of the station, in terms of the station itself, we have a residential usage here, which seems to be very complementary with a lot of the office type trips that are coming and going. So you're seeing, you see less AM entries into the station and more, and more, AM exiting the station, and kind of vice versa. And so a residential usage kind of complements that and from a capacity standpoint. So I think with that, I think that's my last slide, and I'd be happy to answer any of your questions.
Great, thank you very much. Does staff have an additional presentation?
I do have a presentation. Do you want to see it?
If you feel there are things the applicant didn't cover?
I think there are maybe just 2 slides that I will show you if that's okay with you.
Go for it.
We also have 3 speakers for this item.
Great, thank you.
My name is Joanne Gabor, and I'm with DES. Just a couple things that I want to add on that the applicant has not covered in a very comprehensive presentation is this is site plan number 442. It is being withdrawn from site plan 65. Site plan 65 is essentially this whole block. It's composed of about 7 or 8 buildings. I think we all know where the site is. Again, just to kind of run down some of the more technical information, this is within the Crystal City sector plan. The proposal does include rezoning from CO to CO Crystal City. As I mentioned, this is being withdrawn from Site Plan 65 that was originally approved in 1968. There are 302 residential buildings, a little over 22,000 square feet of retail, which comes up with a FAR of 3.84. There is a 24-story building that's being proposed, LEED Silver and Energy Star certification. As was discussed previously, they are maintaining the existing building footprint at grade and utilizing the existing garage. They are also preserving existing trees that exist on the plaza area. The modifications that they're requesting is the build-to line on Crystal Drive. This is where the proposed plaza is. Instead of increasing the building footprint, the bulk plane angle, and the residential parking ratio at 0.8 spaces per unit as previously mentioned. Something that wasn't discussed yet but is being considered with the site plan is a block plan. This is in block Q of the Crystal City sector plan. What is being proposed is there will be two scenarios that will go forward. The scenario on the left, scenario A, is the scenario that is within the Crystal City sector plan today. You will see right here the build-to line does extend all the way out to Crystal Drive. What is being proposed essentially is maintaining this existing open space as an unplanned open space. Based on the LRPC meeting that was held and discussions during SPRC, again, we will be going forward with two options or two scenarios for this block Q as part of the site plan. Again, the existing, I know the applicant didn't touch much on this, but 23rd Street, we will be moving the curb a little bit to the north. There actually is a county project that will be moving the curb to the north a little bit on the western portion of this block between Route 1 and Crystal Drive. This curb will align with that new curb location. This does meet the Crystal City sector plan in terms of clear sidewalks and the overall streetscape width, and this results in an 8-foot clear sidewalk along 23rd Street. On Crystal Drive, we are maintaining the existing curb location, so the existing street section will be maintained. There will be the 8-foot clear sidewalks along Crystal Drive and then also adjacent to the building between the building and the landscape plaza area. Again, this does meet the Crystal City sector plan guidelines. I think we touched on all of the parking. Just to remind everyone, they're utilizing the existing garage and they are at a 0.8 parking spaces for residential. The office parking is going to be dropping down a little bit to 1 space per 665, and the access from 23rd Street will be eliminated. They are providing bicycle parking per the minimum standards, and the loading will be maintained along Crystal Drive. With that, staff does support the project and recommends approval. If you have any other questions, I am happy to answer them. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. I believe now we'll take our speakers.
Our first speaker is Arthur Fox, followed by Krista All.
Mr. Chairman, Commission members, I'm Arthur Fox, speaking this evening on behalf of the Arlington Ridge Civic Association, solely for the purpose of asking each of you a question that I hope you will ponder and possibly even do a little research before you try and answer it. And that question is whether the traffic impact analyses, the TIAs, that developers are required to perform as part of the 4.1 site plan review process adequately inform the county of the prospective impact of new high-rise, high-density buildings will have on the county's transportation infrastructure in urban development and adjacent residential areas of the county in the years to come. In case you're not familiar with the county's TIA process, basically the developer is required to retain an independent contractor to measure existing traffic flow at intersections a block or two from the prospective building sites at various times of day. And the contractor then prognosticates how the traffic will likely increase as a result of vehicles coming and going to and from the site once the new building has been built and occupied. The analysis does not, however, project the collective impact of all the new buildings yet to be built in accordance with PDSPs or site plans, or sector plans rather, of which any particular building will be just one piece of a far more complex puzzle, a larger puzzle. Nor do TIAs look at existing or projected traffic choke points, whether just beyond the radius of the TIA or a greater distance, but one through which traffic that will be generated by the new building must necessarily pass through. This problem is particularly acute in 22202, given that it is, for all intents and purposes, a geographic fortress with essentially only 5 portals through which all traffic must flow into and out of 22202. For your information, the 3 22202 civic associations, of which ARCA is one, have been begging the county now for many years to revise the TIA process required of developers to yield more meaningful information. Suffice it to say, we've been stonewalled. We did so again in the context of this Century Center project. And as in the past, we again received empty promises from the staff. In conclusion, we respectfully submit the time has come when to elevate this issue for consideration and perhaps action by the county board, and ask that you help us do that in your submission to the board in connection with this site plan. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Fox.
And our next speaker is Krista All, followed by Natasha Atkins.
So here I am again to use up another 5 minutes of your evening. On this generally laudable and welcome project, we have no concerns about non-transportation issues this time, and also no specific concerns about traffic circulation or access. So I will instead use it as an illustration of our concerns about broader issues related to traffic and transportation in our area. Mr. Fox just asked you the question about the usefulness of the current TIAs for assessing the impact new high-rise buildings will have on the county's transportation infrastructure. Like him, I'm very interested in your answers, because in my opinion, the basic answer is clear. They're mostly useless. But as we have been pursuing changes to the TIAs for a year now, with an initial commitment a few years ago, but then with nothing more than repeated promises, we hope the benefit of your experience, and above all, your explicit support, will strengthen our case when we are now bringing it to the county board. Using Century Center as an illustration, we are not much helped by the results of the TIA. Often the TIA amounts to nothing more than what I would call a block circulation plan for vehicles and pedestrians. Estimates of movements in the intersections of the 4 streets surrounding a project do not tell us much, especially not if in some other case it just confirms that a failed intersection is about to get slightly worse. Instead, we see the need for a broader focus in 2 different ways. First, for each section of our overall 22202 area, particularly then in Crystal City and Pentagon City, there will always be ramifications of a new project in an area substantially larger than just the streets immediately surrounding the block. Together with the community, who knows the lay of the land and existing issues, the scope of the TIA should be determined on a case-by-case basis. Second, for each case, an inventory should be taken of the known trouble spots and bottlenecks, which might be worsened to the detriment of all travelers, and also would cause, perhaps unexpectedly, serious drawbacks for the new project. In the case of Century Center, we have some bad examples of such situations. There is the obvious case of one failed intersection between 23rd Street and Route 1. The situation is exacerbated by the closeness of the intersections with each street to the west and extreme closeness to the intersection with Clark Bell to the east. And finally, the intersection with Crystal Drive, where also a major garage entrance complicates things. County plans are now belatedly underway, but on a piecemeal basis. Similarly, the transit way with its dedicated or semi-dedicated lanes have caused nightmare situations on Crystal Drive at 27th, 26th, and 23rd Street through thoughtless design. The county has frequently promised, but so far steadfastly refused to deal with these hazardous locations, which are so bad that the police refuse to do enforcement in this area. Especially the situation at 23rd Street could, of course, impact the new project negatively. So my point is that the TIAs are also far too one-sided by solely asking the question, what negative effects, if any, will a new project cause on the traffic situation in the immediate area? As we see it, there is an obvious need for symmetry through the question, what does the county need to do in terms of removing and remedying known problems, which could undermine the success of new projects? Thank you for your attention, and we look forward to your strong support.
Thank you, Mr. All.
And our final speaker for this item is Natasha Atkins.
Hi, good evening. I'm the president of the Aurora Highland Civic Association. We're in the middle between Crystal City and Arlington Ridge. I won't reiterate the points that both of them have made about the cumulative impacts and the unfilled promises about looking more broadly at TIAs. I would like to talk about one specific issue that we have on our side of Route 1, because this project is a stone's throw, almost literally, from our biggest concern, which is the intersection that Krista mentioned at 23rd and Route 1. We have been in discussions with DES since last October about the ripple effects of traffic at this intersection and the nearby, very nearby intersection at Eads Street and 23rd. They have very serious ripple effects on our neighborhood as traffic backs up along Eads, and because they can't get through, turn onto Eads, onto 23rd and cross Route 1 or get onto Route 1. So I could show you photos of beer delivery trucks getting stuck on the small residential side streets, lawns that are being driven over by irate commuters whose Waze app has taken them through the neighborhood. A number of cars that have been sideswiped by traffic cutting through. So last fall, in October, we had a resolution that we passed at ACA to ask the county to erect signage that would try to mitigate the cut-through traffic off of Eads. We've had no response from the county about signage. They did come talk to us a month ago, and they said they were focused on the intersection, trying to unbollix the intersection at 23rd and Route 1. 23rd and Eads. And we realize that this is a crux of the problem, but there are fixes which have to do with trying to prevent illegal parking at the corner by the 7-Eleven, trying to get a right turn lane only onto Route 1. We don't know whether those will work. We don't know what their plan is for evaluating the success of those short-term fixes. And all of this is to say that so far, there has been no improvement to the intersections at 23rd Street, either at Route 1 or at Eads. And the prospect of further complications on 23rd on the other side of Route 1 has Aurora Highlands residents extremely anxious. So we would like some assurance that the applicant is coordinating with DES, keeping abreast of the traffic changes that may result from the various fixes that DES is looking at those two intersections, so that the project doesn't exacerbate our existing traffic issues in the neighborhood. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Atkins.
And that concludes our speakers for this item.
Thank you, Mr. Best. All right. I'll go ahead and start with a question for staff. Regarding Mr. Fox's comments about traffic impact analysis, to some extent, I agree that they're not as useful as they could be. But the notion that they don't take into account other development that is in the pipeline doesn't jive with my past recollection and experience. Can you talk to that? I seem to remember we'll often see a traffic impact analysis that shows a level of service that's already being impacted by other development that's been approved.
That is correct. And essentially, the traffic impact analysis, they look at 3 scenarios, and I'll let the applicant, if I say something wrong, please correct me. There's existing conditions, there's future conditions, which is just with a standard level of growth, and then they look at the future conditions with the proposed building and then other proposed site plans that have already been approved that haven't been built. So for example, I believe this project, they included Met Park 6, baby. I don't remember. Anyways, the point is that they do take into account proposed development that is coming, and we do have a regional forecast that we do use for growth. So I I agree with you. I believe that we take into account the future, and we are looking at the future in our TIAs currently.
Thank you. Can the applicant speak to what, if any, future unbuilt development is included in this particular traffic impact analysis?
Yeah, I think there were 4 projects at Park 4-5, the Bartlett. That traffic wasn't already on the network when we did our counts. The We Live project and the old post office on Eads were ones that were identified. What we do when we sit down with staff and we go through a scoping process and we determine what projects do we think are in the pipeline that have been approved. And sometimes they're not even approved, but they're kind of known, they're in the works right now, and we think that those are going to be generating trips and they need to be put on the network and considered. And so that, along with a future growth, we look at the COG model, we look at historic traffic data counts, and we look at what that growth is, even without considering those other projects. So we come up with this future horizon that is what we call the background horizon, and that's before we put any site trips on. And so that's pretty typically how it's done, just industry-wide. And sometimes we actually find that we're that list of things that we add and those things that we put on the network, we're being extra conservative, and we're probably overestimating the number of trips because traffic engineers have a tendency to be kind of conservative. So we try to look at that right, but yes, it's accounted. I mean, we try our best to try to account for future growth that's going to happen, even without this project.
Thank you. Commissioner Calkins.
Doesn't want to turn on. It's on. Okay. Where's the light? Oh, sorry. I have another process question as well for my own edification. The Crystal City Sector Plan, I'm assuming when it was originally done, had some sort of transportation analysis associated with it, as does the TMP, and have those, identified improvements for Crystal City that are, part of a larger vision for Crystal City that these applicants are coming in and, contributing towards, that are kind of maybe bigger than just their site application?
That is correct. The Crystal City Sector Plan was adopted a couple years ago, and with that, there was the Crystal City Multimodal Plan that did look more holistically at the Crystal City area. Additionally, from that, we then come up with capital improvement projects that the county takes on. As was being referenced before, there is a county improvement project that's being taken on 23rd Street that's essentially from the western edge of this project that will then go all the way to the west to Eads Street. So we have been, as someone mentioned, we have been coordinating with them, and that's why this actually, timing-wise, I think is going to work out really nicely, because based on our construction schedule, the construction schedule of the applicant, I think they're going to jive pretty nicely. So when the applicant moves their curb on 23rd Street out, those 4 feet, that will line up with where the new curb will be for the remaining portion of 23rd Street. So we don't have any of those kind of funky 3 or 4 foot kind of transitions that sometimes make traffic a little more difficult.
Other commissioners? Commissioner Gearhart?
Going back to the matters raised by the speakers, I sense, and perhaps 1 or 2 of the speakers could jump up and explain a little further, but I assume the concern here is not so much about this particular building and whether the applicant has things right or not, but it's the larger picture, the impact of traffic patterns as they stand now on the neighborhoods, the residential communities around Crystal City, which has to also impact the functionality of Crystal City and the office district itself. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think what you're looking for is some kind of broader study on the part of the county as to how we make the road system and all in Crystal City work better for both the residential communities that are particularly to the west of Crystal City, but also to the people who live and work in Crystal City. Am I correct on that? Yes. And there's also the point, I think you also made the point that you have been asking the county to engage in kind of some kind of study like this. And just So my question for staff is whether staff has a response to that, and are there plans to engage in that kind of a study? Because it would seem if we can address some of these things through a study, it's probably a win-win situation for everyone. And also note that with Crystal City, much of that development in terms of how the blocks were laid out occurred back 40 years ago, 45 years ago. This particular block even, I think today, if I read the maps right here, today we would be breaking that block up. You would not have a loading dock on Crystal Drive, which impedes the flow of traffic potentially. It would be on a side street because we would have applied good Jane Jacobs techniques and whatever, and short blocks, and broken the blocks up, gotten these things off the arterials. Anyway, do you have a response to that in terms of how we might create a win-win situation for the community, both locally and at large?
I do, and I think we have kind of two separate issues. We have the Century Center site plan that we're looking at today, and then we have that bigger TIA question that I know we have had some conversations with Arthur and some of the other folks. Those discussions are taking a little longer than this site plan timeline is, if you will. But the county has been looking at it. I know we have had some meetings with some of the folks. I do not know the status today, but I know there has been some engagement between the county staff and some of the Crystal City folks. And it's something we are looking at, and we are trying to figure out what is the best way to meet everyone's goals. I think additionally, we are also looking at, does it make sense to update what is provided for the TIAs for the development? So as the applicant mentioned, they did include this multimodal portion. That may be something that we decide we want to include for all of the TIAs going on, but as you know, that's a much longer process to change what's in the TIA, as opposed to us just saying, applicant, will you do this for us? Because of some of the discussions, the applicant was willing to do it on this project, but there will need to be a bigger discussion before we change the standard TIA requirements, if you will. And that's something that I'm sure you all would be engaged in as well.
Could I ask one more question, and that's a very different question regarding this building. In going through some of the numbers here on the parking, it looked like there are, 8 accessible parking spaces in the garage. Am I correct in that number? Is that consistent with county policy, or are we sort of using an existing garage to kind of provide for these spaces? I mean,
I'm going to let
is this the right number? That's really the question.
I'm going to let the applicant answer that question.
Yeah, so for the parking space, oh, sorry. Great. So for the parking spaces, we are meeting the new codes for accessibility. We're actually removing a portion of the existing structure to allow van accessibility on the first level.
That was going to be my next question, because oftentimes vans can't get into the garages.
They can't because of the existing conditions, but we're going to remove some structure to allow some van spaces and residential spaces, as well as meeting the code requirements for the new construction.
Okay, that's helpful.
Thanks. So with leaving Crystal Drive's curb as it is, how does the current Crystal Drive cross-section compare to what's called for in the sector plan? Didn't seem to be addressed in the staff report.
I believe what they're proposing is what is proposed in the sector plan.
Okay. It matches. All right. That's all I need to know. Any other commission questions or comments? In regards to the TIAs, I agree. I think this is something we need to delve into deeper, and that there's definitely room for improving what we ask of our applicants from a transportation impact analysis standpoint. I look forward to potentially working through that with the community and with staff. but I don't think it's necessarily appropriate or germane to address it as part of our action on this site plan. So with that said, I move that we recommend that the county board adopt an ordinance to approve an amendment to site plan number 65 to withdraw this site from the existing site plan with modifications for parking ratio, off-site parking and density subject to all existing conditions and the new conditions attached to the ordinance, and adopt the proposed Crystal City block plan, adopt the attached resolution to approve this site plan for 302-unit multifamily building with approximately 22,000 square feet of ground floor retail for the property located at 2351 Jefferson Davis Highway with modifications for parking ratio, off-site parking, bulk plane angle, and all other modifications subject to the new conditions attached to the ordinance as outlined in the county manager's recommendation in our draft board report. And that has a second. Is there any further conversation on the motion? Commissioner Gerhart.
I would ask, and perhaps by unanimous consent, that our letter to the board note that we had 3 speakers on this issue and the issue they raised about the parking. Even though I agree this is not a reason to hold up this project or do anything with it, I mean, different with it, but I think it would be useful for the board to note that 3 people came out, including at least 1, maybe 2 presidents of civic associations, to raise the issue and essentially just flag it, without comment in the sense that the commission did not take a position on it. I don't think we need to go that far, but to at least note for the county board that they came out and raised the issue.
Does any commissioner object to inclusion of that notion and in the letter to the board? Then it's so shall be. Any further conversation on the motion? All those in favor? That's unanimous. Thank you very much for your time.
Our next item is item 5, the Master Transportation Plan Bike Element. Rich Viola is here this evening to give you an overview.
Good evening. My name is Rich Viola. I am Planning Section Supervisor for Arlington County Transportation. And I'll give you a presentation on this kind of quick, just kind of run through it, just to kind of update you on things. And I do have a handout, which I'll ask Mr. Best to kind of supply to the group. Just to kind of run through this, if you are not aware, within our master transportation plan, we have the 8 elements, one of which is the bicycle element adopted in 2008, which we are now have begun an update of. And this is being done entirely with in-house staff, myself as the project manager, but many folks from across Arlington County DES involved in the process as well. And guiding us through this, we have a working group led by Mr. Slatt as the chair of this Transportation Commission, and Transportation Commission being sort of the lead organization kind of guiding us through this process. We have the working group, Chairman Slatt, kind of also chairman of that working group. It has a number of constituent groups represented, Bicycle Advisory being one, but others, Planning Commission and many others, and as well as several folks who have been recruited specifically to help out as kind of at-large members to help and kind of give us a broader perspective on things. So we're trying to get beyond just the typical cyclist to sort of more the typical Arlingtonian. And so since many people ride in different ways or different amounts of time they spend bicycling and different amounts of confidence riding cycling, as a cyclist, we try to incorporate that, and so we're trying to broaden our outreach. So what we've had is 2 meetings now of this working group. We met in May and June, and we'll have another one scheduled for the latter part of July. And this is a sort of a summary of the first 2 meetings. What we've kind of achieved is a couple of things so far. One is we have a plan for how we're going to undertake this update of the MTP bike element. It's basically going to be done in sort of 2 stages. First of all, we're going to start with a kind of an update of a framework, the goals and policies, the sort of the vision of the plan, which we'd like to bring to the board before the end of this calendar year, 2017. And then the second part would be kind of beginning the early part of 2018, and maybe through the first 6 or so months of that year, is working on sort of the implementation measures, which is largely going to be a network of bike facilities, much more specific implementation as to how we go about it, as well as maybe prioritizing which ones are going to be done first and identifying sort of the measures in which we'll be doing that are other than just physical. So we have developed that process, and with that, at our last meeting, we talked about the public outreach process to kind of undertake that. And so it's going to be focused in the next few months on sort of awareness, getting people in the Arlington community aware of this process that's going on, doing more outreach to some organizations, and starting likely in the early part of August, starting to do more kind of getting out to people, some pop-up events, using the county fair, other events that are already kind of out there likely, using those to kind of reach out to people, get them aware of the process, and get them sort of starting to think about it. Maybe we'll have several questions that we can ask people that kind of gets us like, how much do you cycle in Arlington? What kinds of things could be done to make it a better place to bicycle? Things like that, to sort of gather in a little bit of information, get people involved, and then we'll have working through the fall on the framework, meeting with the county board to get some input from them, but also having some workshops and more targeted types of public outreach to get us to that point. And then we'll kind of continue a little more heavily in the early part of 2018 when we start getting into the network and other sorts of implementation measures. So that's kind of a run through of where we are. As I mentioned, we're got another meeting on the schedule for early part of, or for that later part of July, and we can report back again after this summer session. And if a group would like us back in September, we could certainly do that as well. And if there's questions, please let me know. Oh, there's a web page with a lot of information. Everything that the working group has done is going up on it, and as well as a lot of the guiding information that the county staff has collected. We've produced sort of what we call a baseline, kind of what the state of bicycling in Arlington as a sort of beginning of this year. And so that's up there. Some information we've collected from some sort of peer cities that we're using as sort of to help us guide us through the process, ones who have undertaken bicycle master plan work in the last 3 or 4 years, using some of that as guidance as well. All that's available up there. If you just go to the Master Transportation Plan on the county's website and look for bicycle element, there'll be a link down to all that as well. So,
Thank you, Mr. Viola. Commissioner Perez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Viola, I'm really excited to see that we're working on this. I know obviously we've been pushing for this for quite a while now, and it's coming to fruition, and I'm especially glad that you'll be managing the project. It makes me feel very confident about it. And, I don't want to speak to the whole commission, but I just personally look forward to trying to make the bicycle corridors in Arlington County the equivalent of commuter routes, in a sense, and that they're treated the same way with the same priority as our other transportation corridors. And so hopefully, I'm sure you'll be taking lots of ideas, and you'll be looking at a lot of different avenues for this, but hopefully the strategy here is just to elevate the level of importance that we place on the bicycle corridors, because so many people are using them as their daily commute. So things like widening or signaling, or similar to what DC has done at the 15th Street corridor and others downtown, more protected lanes, more signaling for lanes, more priority for lanes, and things like that. So Godspeed to you, and I'm glad you're on the case.
Thank you. Thank you.
Other commission comments or questions? Is that your finger up, Mr. Warren? I can't tell if you're vaguely raising your hand.
I'm trying to decide, because this may not be terribly relevant, but a few months ago we had a presentation from county staff on a possible bike lane on Glebe Road. And I know that there have been proposals for that, I think on Lee Highway, is that correct? I think that was in the MTP, the master plan on bicycles, and on other major roads. And I've been concerned mostly about that because of trade-offs that exist. And there's some safety issues there, fewer if there's a bicycle lane, more if there's the, what do you call it, the silhouettes that are in the lane indicating that bicyclists can use a full lane. I think, for example, of Glebe, I mentioned that, but also South George Mason Drive that I use a lot. And they have one of those silhouettes, I forget what what do they call those things? I was close. And I have yet to see one bicyclist right in the middle of the lane on South George Mason Drive. I think many are on the side, and I'm curious about that because if priority is given, if what Commissioner Perez said, he said to give equal priority, that raises concern in my mind about what that means practically, because it can mean in the case of these silhouettes that are used that if people can create a very dangerous situation. So far, I haven't heard of any. I don't know, but that's because in my observation, people tend to stay to the right side. And I'm a bicyclist, so I really understand this, and I have used George Mason Drive to bicycle to the main library, less so now, but I understand the concern. I'm always to the right. It's about as far as I can get because of the concerns that I have about cars that may not see me or that are going fast, and creating a condition where cars are diverting to another lane there since you got two lanes. So I'd just like to ask, in your view, what do you see as future development on bicycle lanes on major roads in Arlington, especially whether they're 20,000, and I'm thinking of the ones that have 20,000 or more vehicle movements a day. I don't know what it is on South George Mason Drive, but it's pretty dense.
Yeah. Those are the most difficult things we have to deal with, is the fact that we have some of these routes which have a substantial amount of traffic, and for most cyclists, riding anywhere on those roads is intimidating. And so we need to figure out how we can either create a place that is reserved for bicyclists, an actual bike lane if possible, and if even more desirable, would have some sort of protection or buffering of the cyclist from the motor vehicles. If we're not really able to create that, find that space, and that's a little bit like what happened with North Glebe Road there in the Ballston area, where we reported on 2 or 3 months ago, are there alternative routes that are parallel to that might provide a good quality bike facility? And that's sort of a fallback position. It's not really the desire to kind of move the bicyclists off the main roads if at all possible, but in some cases we may be sort of caught where we don't have the opportunities to do as much as we would like to on those roads due to the heavy traffic or kind of limited right-of-way that we have to work with. So it's going to be one of the things we're going to have to work through in our planning process, specifically road by road, as to what's the best kinds of bike facility we can provide.
Yeah, I would say one of the things we're most focused on in this update is doing better than we have done in previous plans on picking our battles, like deciding the places where the need for a bike facility is greatest and saying this is a place where the trade-off is necessary, and also being careful to say not just throw bike facilities into other areas because they would be nice to have without recognizing that maybe it's much harder to justify that trade-off in those other areas. Other questions or comments? Commissioner Gearhart.
I'm also a bike rider, but as a pedestrian and driver as well. And sometimes there's a kind of a clash and whatever when you've got 3 different types of people and their movements coming together. Any thought being given in the element in terms of coming up with some ideas that might improve signage, perhaps for bicyclists, where they should slow down because they're encountering pedestrians? I mean, I'm putting aside the part about where bicyclists are just randomly running stop signs and red lights, but where we can hopefully minimize the conflict you have between people that are moving at different speeds. Bicyclists probably slower than cars, but a lot faster than pedestrians, which sometimes confuses drivers. But where we could, through maybe a better signage program in our bike trails, provide better instruction to bicyclists where they need to slow down because of what they're approaching.
Right. I think it's a combination of things that we'll be proposing. One is sort of the education and kind of awareness. We do have a program that we do now that we're trying to educate cyclists, motorists, and pedestrians, the PAL program, Predictable, Alert, Lawful. And the idea is to try to figure out that we all have to share these spaces and how we can do it safely and kind of courteously. But so we'll probably be placing a lot more in kind of resources and emphasis on that. And then I think there are facility changes as well. I've noticed a lot on roads where there is not a bike lane, you see many more cyclists on the sidewalk. And so if we can find opportunities to create bike lanes in the road that are safe and kind of comfortable for people to use, I think you'll see fewer conflicts on the sidewalk between bicyclists and pedestrians. And then we also have a big kind of conflict issue on trails. Bicyclists and many sorts of pedestrians you find on trails, whether they're runners or walkers or other types of pedestrians. So we'll be addressing that as well through the plan.
Commissioner Perez again.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I actually want to echo a couple of very good points that Commissioners Warren and Gerhard pointed out, which is that I do think the silhouettes are not really good enough. I mean, as a cyclist yourself, as a cyclist myself, I think it gives people a false sense of security to believe that they can ride in a road and along with traffic or take up a whole lane. And certainly I'd rather see a protected lane segmented from the main right-of-way. And to Commissioner Gerhard's point, one of the things that I think that comes with the rights that bicyclers gain or that cyclists gain by being elevated to the same level as automobiles and having protected lanes is that they also have the responsibility of following signage like stop signs, like traffic lights. And I think DC's done a pretty good job with this, in that if you look at like the 15th Street corridor, the Pennsylvania Avenue corridor that are segmented bike lanes, there also are traffic lights that have a bicycle, cyclist shaped, to make it extremely clear to cyclists that they are also obligated to follow the signage. It's not just for automobiles, because if you're a pedestrian crossing through the crosswalk, you don't want to get hit by somebody going 20 miles an hour on a bicycle. So I do think that, and I also think Arlington County Police perhaps should prioritize ticketing bicyclists who are not obeying traffic rules. I mean, that the state driving laws mandate that cyclists stop at stop signs. I mean, there's no reason not to ticket. It's just that it hasn't been a priority. But as we find more opportunities for pedestrians and cyclists and automobiles to collide, I think there should be a priority in some sense on the signage, on the ticketing. And then, Mr. Viola, you raised an excellent point about trails, and it would be nice if, as part of this, the bike element, if we could look at potentially widening trails and giving a pedestrian right-of-way and a bicycle right-of-way too.
Right. That is an issue that's come up. One of the things I did fail to mention was at our last working group meeting, we did have kind of a roundtable amongst our members, and they raised a lot of issues, as well as the Bike Advisory Committee raised a lot of issues, kind of priorities with them. And so I've put together a list, and it's about 50 things, and so we're kind of sifting through how we can incorporate that into the first kind of draft of the framework. And all these issues, I think, have come up within that discussion. So.
Yeah, I think we've brainstormed about 5 years of work for an 18-month process. So we'll have to be choosy. Yeah. All right. Mr. Best, anything else?
Our next item is the Complete Street program update. Did you want me to take care of this? Or?
Actually, I can take care of
Okay.
it too. So, and if you wouldn't mind just kind of handing those out. I'll just kind of cover this. We have been working on getting this program going. The most significant thing was getting us to a point where we could actually put it out for a call for applications, which we've done now. It was our beginning part of May through June 16th was our application period. We had a extensive kind of outreach process that took place, presentations to this commission, to a number of other commissions, and kind of community groups as well took place during that time. And we've had a kind of an online rollout. A lot of information went out through the Nextdoor, social media, number of other places. And the kind of the outcome of this process was we got close to 360 applications for projects, which is kind of what we thought might happen. The good thing is we were able to kind of evaluate where those were coming in halfway through and sort of adjust some of our outreach so that we tried to reach out to some of the groups that maybe, or locations within the county that weren't getting in the initial batch that we didn't see too many applications for. So we wound up getting a pretty broad swath of Arlington County. I think 50 different neighborhood associations. There was an application for at least one. Many had quite a lot. And so we also did some specific outreach trying to targeting some of the more multifamily areas, doing a little bit of bilingual Spanish and English presentations and kind of posters in some of the community centers and things like that. And so we're still kind of looking through all these applications right now, trying to figure out what it means. I gave you a little kind of brief sort of these pie charts that kind of identified sort of when people applied, what sort of problems were they kind of specifying. And this is based on sort of a sample of about 100 of them. But you can see what came up mostly was concern about speeding on streets. This isn't going to be a neighborhood traffic calming program, but we will probably be addressing speeding in various measures when we do some actual projects that construct things on some of these streets. Sidewalks obviously was a pretty significant one too, as you can see there. But there are a number of different things about safety, street lighting and such. And one of the things I could say is from that 360 applications, we'll probably have a lot fewer when we've kind of finished going through it, is we saw quite a lot of duplications, 5 or 6 people on the same street or same block even applying for the same sort of project. That happened quite a bit. Also, there were many people who were asking for sort of maintenance type things, like fix this broken sidewalk or the fire hydrant that's not working or something like that. Those, we're going to have to figure out how to address those outside of our program, and so we'll be putting notifications out to those people who applied to tell them kind of how we're addressing those, whether it's a study to look at whether a stop sign is warranted or just sending a crew out there to fix the broken sidewalk, that kind of thing. So we'll probably over the next 2 months or so be kind of working through those 360 or so applications and getting to the point where we'll be collecting some data in the fall, and then we can actually do a real evaluation of the ones that are kind of seem like legitimate neighborhood complete streets type projects, rank them, and figure out which ones we can kind of take to the board for funding. Now, we'll be limited in the number of projects we can do because we don't have a lot of money, but we'll at least have a sense as to what's out there. And I think this was a really good exercise in kind of hearing from the community, what are the issues on your streets? Because many of them responded, and a lot of things we heard we may not have known about. So it was good in that regard. So we're going to continue to be meeting with our Neighborhood Complete Streets Commission, and that will be kind of ongoing. And just to say, we actually have a change in the chair of that commission. Isaac Ortiz, former Transportation Commission member, is now taking over from Kevin Sweeney after he spent 9+ years kind of working in this area. We thank him for his service. But there's still an opening for a Transportation Commission member if someone would like to kind of join that group as well. So that's my report.
Thanks. Any commissioner questions or comments, other than glad to see this continuing along? All
right. Next meeting is August 31st. That's our next general TC for September. And of course, we've added a special meeting September 13th for the Crystal City VRE station. And staff has nothing else to add.
Yep, so everybody get that on your calendar. That's relatively new. That's not a date that you had the first time around. That will be a carryover meeting where we will almost certainly only deal with the Crystal City VRE station, and the board will be expecting a recommendation from us on what their position should be on the Crystal City VRE station.
And it has been added to our website.
Great.
So you're saying that September, that's only for the purpose of VRE, as a carryover?
Right, so we will have our normally scheduled meeting on August 29th, and then we will have a carryover meeting. Our August 31st is our normally scheduled meeting, and then we will have a carryover meeting on September 13th with, I get to set the agenda, so I reserve the right to change it slightly if necessary, but my current thinking is that the only agenda item on September 13th will be the Crystal City VRE station.
Well, I must have misheard then. I heard September the 3rd. I wrote that down earlier in the meeting.
September the 13th.
13th, oh, okay.
7:30.
You have a place?
We did get this room, correct?
At this room, yes. It will be televised.
So, Mr. Best, this is an interesting situation here, because I kind of feel like I would love to get some answers to some questions from the VRE folks before we walk into that room on September 13th. So is that something that we can potentially email some questions and get a mass response back from the VRE folks distributed via email over the summer here?
Yeah, I think that's definitely, advisable, and we'll facilitate that.
All right. No, we will have a VRE rep on the 13th.
I'm assuming there'll be a final report that they'll forward to us for a review as well before that evening?
I'm assuming that. Of course, we're ways off, and
Because I think for me, that'd be very helpful to be able to sit down and read kind of the reasoning behind the decision-making process.
Number one is definitely, we sent some links out. Before this meeting, there was an email that said, go look at this report here on the VRE website and stuff. They may change that, but that was what they were considering, that VRE was considering their final report. Let's look.
It was sent out last week. It was emailed last week.
Yeah, it was all their public meeting presentation materials for the public meeting that happened right after our last meeting. It certainly looked that way. Yes, so I would definitely review that, and then please forward me any questions one-on-one that you have for VRE that you think would be useful to try and get answered prior to the meeting. And I'll create one big list, and we'll send one big list of questions over. And then, yes, we will have a VRE rep at the September 13th meeting to answer questions that continue to come up in the meeting. All right.
I think we'll have to see how this unfolds over the next several weeks.
So sometimes stuff goes to the board without a county manager recommendation. They said any of the three options, none of the three options would preclude a connection to National Airport.
In other words, they prioritize access to Metro Rail. If you could walk from the VRE station to the Metro Rail at Reagan Airport, is that a possibility?
That sounds like a question you should forward me via email to be sent along to VRE. No, you're going to email that to me or it's not going to go in the list. My memory is not good. Send me an email. All right. Anything else for the good of the order that's not talking about things that were on our agenda outside of that agenda item. All right, I will see you all in August, and I will hear from you via email about VRE stuff in the interim. And
Send out a reminder email to the entire commission probably early next week about VRE questions.
And don't forget, we still need a TC member for Neighborhood Complete Streets, and my understanding is the Market Commons site plan review process is probably going to kick off. So if you've, okay, there we go. Commissioner Culkins would like to do Market Commons site plan review. Awesome.
I was going to say, I might be interested in that.
All right.
I don't have to take it if you
We are adjourned.